Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a new Glad World Languages webinar in collaboration with Central States. We're very grateful to have you with us today. That being said, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our session for today, Sustainability Across Cultures, Exploring Global Perspectives Through Language. As I mentioned before, this webinar is in collaboration with Central State Languages for All, and today we are very happy to have the Executive Director of Central States, Daryl Bialas, to say a few words. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're very excited to be able to partner with CLET World Languages this year in order to bring you some additional offerings that tie to our 2025 conference theme, which is Global Goals, Global Languages. We're going to be in Kansas City, March 13th through the 15th, coming up real quick. And we hope that you will join us in Kansas City for this conference. But the webinars that we've been working on with CLET this year have really helped to enhance that theme, which is near and dear to all of us. And so I'm really excited about this webinar tonight that Tyler's going to be providing for you related to sustainability, because that does tie in to the United Nations Sustainability and Development Goals, which ties directly to our conference. So again, thank you so much. If you'd like more information on Central States or on our Central States Conference, which is coming up, please visit our website, which is right behind me there, centralstatesconference.org. Thank you again. And Tyler, the floor is yours.
And thanks so much. And I'm really excited to be with everyone here tonight and to talk to you further about the Central States and CLET World Languages collaboration with sustainability, especially when we start talking about sustainability across cultures while looking at exploring global perspectives through languages. Again, my name is Tyler William Johnson. I'm actually one of the World Language Sales Consultants in the Midwestern region. So you maybe have heard my name or maybe have seen me around. And also, I'm really excited to join you all because this topic is really passionate to me. I am one of those kids who grew up in the 90s and 2000s where, we were talking about the ozone layer and we really started bringing in the sustainability practices into all of our courses, and then moving into college and then into my own career. Sustainability has always been a core part of my life through my love of travel, through sustainable transportation, then also making sure that I sustain languages and cultures through all means possible, as we'll explore tonight. So what are we going to see today? The first is I'm actually going to hear a little bit from you. I want to see a quick poll, and we'll see this in just a minute, where I'm able to hear a little bit about how you maybe use sustainable practices in your classroom, but then also how familiar you are with this to help me better guide the conversation that we may have today. After that, we'll talk a little bit further about sustainability in the world language classroom. I know we've heard about this a lot already in our webinar series in collaboration with Central States, but we'll dive into it a little bit further into the perspective that I've seen for us tonight. And then we will then talk about integrating global voices into the world language classroom and how this is done possible, especially through examples from our textbooks and through other ways that you can always bring in these voices into that world language classroom. We'll then dive into sustainability with technology in world language, because again, I've always had technology around me, and technology really helped guide my language acquisition as I started learning German many years ago. And then it's also now helped guide me through my retention of my German skills and then also going into my French abilities. And now seeing with how we as World Languages have progressed with this and how other language organizations are progressing with technology, this is going to be one of my favorite topics to talk about tonight. So now we will go into our poll. If you could please take out your phone, I'll give about 5 or 10 seconds. Or if you have your computer out or your iDevice, whichever may be possible, go ahead and take that out. And if you have a phone, get ready to scan a QR code. Or if you're going to go to a website, we will give you the website here in just a minute. But if you're all ready, we will now go to menti.com. And once you're at menti.com, or once you have scanned this QR code, you can then give in the code 4687058. Okay, So now, since it seems like some people are starting to come in, I will give a little bit more time. But then once you're in, there will be some questions that appear. So the first question that you will see up here that I would like for you to answer, and wow, it looks like a lot of you are answering this already, is do you talk about sustainability across cultures in your classroom? It seems like the mass majority so far do not use this much, which is okay. I completely understand. There are several of you that are saying a little bit. Of course, we have to, some things maybe just are implicitly incorporated, right? Yes, we're about to start our next chapter. Hey, I'd love to hear that. We do have, I just blanked on the day, the Environmental Day coming up in April. And then yeah. So, and this is a great reason to be in this webinar tonight, because then we will be able to really dive into some more reasons or some ways that you can start using sustainability practices, maybe some perspectives you've not ever thought about with this, but then also we can continue on from there. So, our next question, and I see many of you have already started answering this one as well. What's your familiarity with sustainability topics in the classroom? So, of course, a lot of you, just based on what you said already, I understand this. Oh, I have an expert here. I can't wait to collaborate with you potentially further to talk more about this quite a bit. That's really great to hear this as well. And then to final this as well, do you consider technology being an issue for sustainability? And I do love seeing how this graph actually goes in this flow because it is interesting to see where this average could end up being. I would have put myself in level 3 here, but can also understand that you do not equate this, or maybe you don't think this is an issue at all. So, yeah. So I'm really excited to continue talking to you all more about this, to go into some of these topics today within technology. The last question we have on here, I don't know why this closed out, but of course we have on here, what excites you about this? And, we have lots of great things on here. Language acquisition, of course, being the top priority, especially when we talk about when, how to prepare teachers to be best in the classroom and some best practices within the classroom as well. And I'll make sure all these results are shared so that you can go back and maybe use these in class too. So the first topic that we're going to go over tonight will be sustainability in world language classroom, combining sustainability themes and world language education. A few items that go hand in hand that I saw, especially while diving into a bit with this, is linking 21st century skills with sustainability. Most of our students walk into the classroom and they ask, why do I even have to take a foreign language at this point? Why are we learning a world language? And studies show that world languages actually do help not just the society progress more, but also economic factors progress more because then students are able to go into careers where then they can use that language skill that they developed earlier in life to then progress more into maybe presenting, maybe going abroad to help negotiate, maybe working in sales as I've now done with my German language acquisition. There's lots of great things that 21st century skills can automatically build by learning languages and by bringing in these sustainability topics. You also can then go into the world readiness skills with sustainability, showing how students will coincide these with critical thinking skills, with making sure they have more presentational skills, because this will help their language ability even further, and then that will deepen their critical thinking even across all other subject matters. And we'll see a few examples of this in a few minutes. Of course, I've already alluded to or maybe said cross-curricular once or twice, but of course, with cross-curricular studies, this really does help because when we think about STEM, or as we now maybe say STEAM topics, it's really great to incorporate your language acquisition with other subjects that are being discussed either in that K-12 or higher ed environment. One thing that was always great that I saw across different language programs, I see now, and I hear at different conferences, is that lots of teachers don't just want to teach grammar anymore, but rather how grammar is used across different cultural perspectives, but not just that, how we really use it maybe in the science fields or in the excuse me in the histories or other fields that will help us out with not just language acquisition, but also furthering our abilities with sustainability topics and cross-curricular studies. And of course, we do want to diversify our classroom in terms of sustainability. So what exactly can this mean in your area? We'll show some examples in a bit about how it's always a great reminder to show the cultures that could have been in your area beforehand, the cultures that are from that area originally, but also some other cultures that we'll see that are being preserved today that might not be as around as much, but we are now through technology able to preserve these cultures. So when we talk a bit further about 21st century skills and sustainability, of course, with all of these, we have to think of the actual standards or these anchor standards in different states when we really start looking into critical thinking, of collaboration, creativity, and communication. All of these skills will be brought open more when you bring in sustainability topics because you're really opening the student in order to see other perspectives that might not be discussed as often at home in daily discourse, what have you, and this will really help them to then further their knowledge depending on where their direction could go. Of course, this really does bring in more of the creativity skills with students because they are linking their own culture and having cultural comparisons to then maybe bring in items that can then help their own communities. And of course, this will help in communication because if they're able to talk about this in a second language, third language, etc., then it would be will help them even better to become more proficient in their own language. Of course, this does heighten problem solving skills and how we can always, help the world, leave the world a little better than we came into it to. And then also bring in items of digital literacy, making sure that students aren't just literate in the form of reading on in a book, but also literate in the form of going on the computer and knowing really how to find these authentic resources and be even better researchers through topics. Couple examples that we'll now look at with this. And of course, a few will come from our textbooks as I do work at Clet World Languages, but also I will show examples from other perspectives so that we can see a variety. But here in one of our upcoming books, in Deutsch, the second edition, this is from our level 2, we have one of our authentic documents here where it's showing that, our planet, in this case, is quite literally dying, and what this current news article or even I would say maybe news article we could call it is talking about when it comes to this topic and how you can then even go even further into context about what are some top words that you're hearing with this, what are some other topics that you can go into, but not just that, there's lots of great information just in this one photo for students to really start learning about a bit of culture that is going on in that area at this particular time, but also how this topic of sustainability is currently being portrayed in that culture you're studying as well. And with this example, I think it's really great too, because in Germany, and as I maybe have said, I studied German and then taught German for a few years. Was one topic that always came forward over and over again throughout my studies of how Germany is one of the top, or it tries to be one of the top influencers when it comes to sustainable practices. When we go further, the next three examples we will see from the United Nations, and as we are a bit in collaboration with this as well, how we can look at the sustainable topic goals within that. So here, of course, we have it in our German form so that our students of German can start learning these. We also have this in our Italian textbook too for Davvero Due, and within Davvero Due, they're able to see this about the Agenda 2030 and how in Italy, this is one of the big agendas that they're really working on to really progress to be a more sustainable, green, if you will, country. Then, of course, we always have this if we wanted to look at it in the sense of the sustainable goals from the United Nations in English, so that we're able to then really progress these topics. And one thing that's really great about these topics, I believe, is that they do really weave quite well into your syllabi literacy topics as well as your APIB or any other language proficiency exams so that you can really make sure that students are learning language acquisition as is being spoken today. Some other great examples that we can talk about is just bringing in random cultural bits with us, but also having a grammar topic in it. So in this particular example, we will cycle through the interpretive mode of communication, whereby we will read or receive this input to then later be able to discuss a bit more about what we have learned here. And what we do see here with this is that we are saying goodbye to certain items. We're also saying, what are items starting to become maybe are we feeling a little hotter? Is it starting to go down? Starting to have, maybe taking a shower instead of taking a bath. So lots of great things for students to really think about because these are items that they're also probably thinking about in their own culture and other forms of courses that they're taking. Maybe out in certain states you have droughts where they really have to think about water conservation, whereas other states where this might not be a topic, it's a great way to just remind everyone that these are great things that connect us all as around the world. And with this, we always do want to remember that we want to bring in diverse voices as well. So, where do we hear this from all voices around the world? And another example from our new series, Impulse Deutsch 2, that's coming out this year, we see here that each of these people will define what sustainability means to them. And then this could be a great example for then students after they've heard a few other students talk about sustainability in their own life. Then those students then go back and talk about what sustainability means for them. And then you can progress on from that either as a project or even as a great speaking example for the day. Of course, with these, and I've alluded through a few of these words so far, we will always find ways to cycle through interpersonal, the interpretive, as well as presentational modes of communication. Because with these examples, students will always have some type of grammar and vocabulary that will be new to them within a lot of these sustainability topics. Maybe the topic is a little high for your student, but you find ways with AI to manipulate that in order to make the text more attainable for your students. But then also students will be implicitly learning lots of new items that they could find interesting, but also that will then help their own language acquisition. This, of course, does help with the alignment of the syllabi literacy with global competency and responsibility, helping everyone become a better global person through language learning and through sustainability topics. Of course, as my colleague Katrin did a few months ago, you can incorporate ESD themes into your world language curriculum to make sure that students are really understanding the importance of environments, and especially with sustainable development. And as we'll see in a few examples here, bringing in project-based learning curriculum to really engage students in the language so they don't feel like they're always drilling vocabulary and grammar, but rather they're really using the language in real-world applications so that they're able to progress their knowledge. As all of our textbooks at CLET are ACTFL aligned, I do tend to go back to the ACTFL readiness standards for language learning. And as we see here as our anchor standards, we always want to make sure that students are cycling through communication, culture, connection, comparisons, as well as communities. And within sustainabilities, all of these topics can easily be hit as long as you are branching it for where your students currently are. One item that I did see while going through a bit of my research for this was that Wisconsin does have really great standards for environmental literacy and sustainability. And within these, they do not directly address world languages, but rather how literacy can be done through sustainable practices such as conserving our rivers, making sure we have more um, uh, blanking on their names now, but the gardens that attract bees and other great ideas that will help more with sustainable practices, but starting in day one when students are really young. And I thought this was a great way to really interlude that all states, it's not just looking at the broad form of this, but the fact that here, even in the Midwest, we're already looking at sustainable practices in order to progress our students' knowledge. Of course, we can't talk about project-based learning without looking at a few projects. And what I think with this project is really great is that students are supposed to organize an exchange or do a cultural or some type of service exchange in class. They will then go through what they would like to do as this cultural exchange. They will go through how they will make this cultural exchange, some items that they will need to achieve or that they may need to buy or may to get support for, whatever have you, so that they can help this change happen in their community. And then from here, they will then present to the class They will then have other students ask them questions, and then also they will be able to create other items within these same topics that students have been talking about. And all of this is by reviewing back through the topics that we talked about within, in this case, this chapter within our series, Le Rapporteur Francophone 3. And what's great about this too is it's always good to give students some type of strategies within these devices as well, so that students really know what they're trying to achieve within this language acquisition, be it that they are trying to actually start a community organization in order maybe to start a trash cleanup or recycling in the community, or even if they are just imagining these items so that one day they do really go out and change the world. Of course, with sustainability in the classroom, we can't forget, and we'll talk a bit more in a few minutes about technology in the classroom. But technology in the classroom is a really big item, especially with this new digital generation, as they're calling them. And for this, it's really great for students to realize what applications are possible for them to have on their phone or even to explore with language acquisition, but also realizing what online learning means, not just in their own cultural perspective, but also online learning in other cultural perspectives. And the example I do have here is from one of our newer series, the Neue Linie 1, which is one of our higher ed German series or language learning school series. And as we see on here on one side, they're supposed to talk about in which situations would these apps be useful or comfortable to be used. And then they go through and choose. And then afterwards, they're supposed to talk about each app, why they would use them, why they maybe would not use them. And then also, there's some sustainability topics that go into this because, as we see here, we have examples of using public transportation. We have examples of using um, food that maybe is going bad, but someone's trying to sell it before it does go bad. And then also we have that people are going to be having a concert at a lake, but then also how you can spend time at the lake as well. So really great examples of how language learning can both be digital, but also how this new generation might want to play around with that digital part of it as they are more familiar with it. Of course, we do need to talk about cross-curricular studies with sustainability. I do always like to say STEAM subjects because I am a student of the arts myself. Not only did I study German, but of course I have played an instrument almost all my life. So I like to always say STEAM subjects here. But with this, it's really great to incorporate our STEAM subjects within the language learning classroom because our students need to see some type of connection with language outside of just coming into that classroom, doing those language drills with you, and then leaving. How can they one day use their language? One of my goals and goals of my students, and I've heard from other teachers and students, was I just want to use the language in whatever capacity that may be. So for me, taking my business German courses, taking my sustainability German courses, being able to help some of my students eventually learn more about music in German, learn more about becoming a nurse in German, lots of great topics. There's ways that you can help students with this in order to find their voice a bit more. And these are all sustainable practices because we need to find ways to keep these form of language in language as well. Of course, I find geography and world language tend to go hand in hand. So it's really easy to bring this up. But one thing that we do need to remember is sometimes to go outside of those countries of interest within the language, then maybe go even further out. One thing I'll show you later in regards to geography and world language will be a German dialect that you might not be thinking that I'll show you. And of course, with this, to sum this up, we do go through connections between languages and personal interests so that forever question, why are we doing this, does need to come back because if I'm learning a language for the reason of I want to find a job, something in engineering or in science, technology, math, the arts, great. How do I then bridge that with my language acquisition? One of the paradigms I found while going through a bit of this is how we can now look at math versus science versus language art, and how all of these do come hand in hand with the idea of all of them do have discourse, you have text and complex text, you have argumentation, purpose for it, structure, sentence, vocabulary practice. So even though the subject might be math, might be science, I was more of a numbers guy myself. It might make more sense to gear that student or help those students go towards that direction with their language acquisition. But as we also know, with the language arts, this will also help students with discourse, with argumentation, and find purpose within language as well. So some examples that I always try to use in my classroom, and also I always encourage other teachers to use, is making sure that they know that it's more than just showing what this traditional life or traditional job progression may be. I always found it a little odd that the first two chapters of my book, it was, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a scientist, I'm going to be, and it was always these jobs. And I taught community college, and most of my students were there saying, I'm going to be a trash collector. I'm going to be a mailman. I'm going to be this, but this wasn't really in my textbook. So remembering that we do have these extraordinary professions out there that help our daily lives and also help progress our sustainable topic. And remember that your students might go into different fields that aren't your traditional what we see in the textbook field. And then also with this, what would you do with your profession? So in this case, we're listening to a news article, perhaps. Which expression are you hearing, and what is this person from a profession? So with this, we're able to hear, really able to see what this person is doing through the interpretive mode of listening. But then also later, we can then progress further and say, what do your parents do? What would you like to do? And then even start going more into complex language structure, even though we're just talking about jobs and jobs that could be. 20 years ago, had you asked me, do you think you'll work at this company? That would not have been on my trajectory. Who knows back then what I was thinking, what I was doing. Other examples is to make sure that we are always bridging this gap between grammar, between vocabulary, and also making sure that we are bringing the sustainability back together. So in this case, this is from a review from our series, the Neue Linie Eins. But as we see here, we are going through a grammar topic, such as in this case, when we have our connecting sentences. But with this as well, we're going through car sharing. We're talking about e-bikes. We're talking about because when I need a car, and different types of ways that we get around. And maybe in some communities, this is the only way to get around, whereas in other communities, the only way to get around is with a vehicle because nothing else is available. So it's really great to bring in those perspectives so that you can challenge your students to think outside of the area that they may be. Awesome. So the next topic I would like to go into for a few minutes will be integrating global voices, exploring how global perspectives are in the world language classroom. And I will show a few examples again from our textbook. And of course, I will go through a few other examples from some other sites that I possibly use within my own teaching, but also I've since discovered by going through conferences and learning from you all as well. Of course, we want to explore the rich heritage of the L2, 3, etc. that is being explored. So what sustainability practices are already being done there? So maybe items that are different than in your own country, maybe things that are very similar. So we're, again, doing these cross-cultural comparisons, great for AP, IB cultural exams. We also need to remember what are some indigenous and ancestral practices that are still being practiced there. So these are great items that you can really bring in, especially when you start talking about how, excuse me, especially when you start talking about how these practices are coming back into society, how we're starting to accept these more in our daily practices, and not just that, how some of these practices still have their traditions today. Where I'm from in the southeast, though, a very religious area, also was a very superstitious area, and it's really interesting then being able to talk about that in a second language as well. One of my favorite topics to always go into with my students, we're going into the oral histories, folklore, and community stories of language, especially since, again, I was a German teacher. I love doing the German Märchen. And so the story tells in German, but not just that. It was really great to bring in what other perspectives of language acquisition is there outside of the traditional what we may see. So try to incorporate all voices. Again, this doesn't just mean all voices, that we can find on the internet, but also make sure that we're bringing, maybe differently abled voices into the mix, as we'll see here in a minute, some neurodivergent voices as well. But also remember that we need to think about immigrant voices, migrants, as well as refugee perspectives, because these also influence how language works and how language will be influenced and how language is sustainable as well. So one example, I will not show the entire of this video, and this video was also originally in German. So I do believe either I will try to link these or have Sabrina link these as well later. But this video is from the Deutsche Welle. It's a German website, news site, and it's called The Invisible Women in Germany. We'll watch just a minute or two of this, and I'll make sure that you can have the link to watch yourself later.
Habibe from Afghanistan has a secret.
I can't write my first or last name.
Paiman also barely knows how to read and write.
Again, thank you for your patience and good old. Great. So going back into this, it's really important to try to bring in as many global voices as possible. And always, in my brain, I am thinking more into this German perspective. So some other items that I also really thought was interesting to make sure that my students were seeing, that this idea of the Barrierefreiheit that we really went into, especially with travel, with looking at the idea of living with being differently abled, as well as other perspectives, really did bring in the idea of sustaining other voices into language acquisition and how we can really incorporate all voices into our language. And again, these are linked inside the presentation, but now since we've had a bit issues, you can go watch, or one is a listening activity for German learners, but then the other one is actually a video that would be great for potentially your level 3, 4s, or even APs or the college level. We also want to make sure that within these sustainability topics, we're keeping in mind cultural norms that could be forgotten within language as well. So making sure that we do bring in culturally appropriate documentation, as well as videos, as we've seen so far, traditional norms, as well as practices that are free of stereotypes as well. And we want to encourage consumption through ethical means, such as in fair trade practices, ecotourism, etc. So a few of the examples that I've seen here we have from our Devero Uno series that students are really looking at the idea of being a tourist within a community. What does this mean to be a tourist? But not just that, how do you also not misuse culture as well to, again, stray free of these cultural stereotypes, but also to preserve cultural identity as well? When we go further into this topic, we think of the idea of tourist or visitor, and what exactly does that mean? And when is a great time to think that you are a tourist versus a visitor in the certain topic itself? And here through this text, it's great to see how one can really see themselves within this perspective, but then also know how they may progress further with it. From our upcoming series, Das Reporter team that will complement our reporter series in K-12, we can also look at the idea that it's not just about talking about these sustainable practices within language, but also we can talk about food. We can talk about how different food items are within those areas, what preservation tools are being taken into account to preserve these authentic food dishes within each areas. What does it mean to eat in a certain area, and what are some habits that you may have? One of the big habits, I picked up and really thought was interesting to always show my students was eating with a knife and fork in Germany versus in America. It seems to be a lot of people just eat with a fork. So just even showing something as simple as that really opens up students' perspectives in how different languages and different cultures even perceive food. how they may perceive fast food versus eating it or not enjoying it, looking at the idea of the grocery store versus the marketplace. So, and that's those cultural comparisons again. And then if we're talking about Vienna here, as we are in this current chapter, of course, you know, my favorite, the cafe house. But what does it mean when we start talking about coffee houses and sustainability as well? As we can continue on, this can go a little political, though in today's webinar, we're not trying to go into that political direction, but of course we can bring into what different political parties in these different target language groups are really talking about when it comes to sustainable practices. So as we see in our new Impulse Deutsch series again, we're talking about the different ways of how we are looking at maybe leading nuclear energy, but then also the different ways that the Green Party is really bringing these items into public discourse. And what does that mean to your students, and possibly where are they seeing it in their own perspective? How does energy work in their area? Is it more of a coal versus wind farms? Is it more river versus other forms? It's really great to know so that students can really start seeing how other areas are doing this, but also how then they can compare that with their own language acquisition. One example I did see from a lecturer who and I am blanking on their name now, but they did this paper after doing a course of sustainability in a business German course. I find it great that, you know, you also want to make sure that your students are seeing the outcomes of what should be learned in this current subject matter. So afterwards, working with sustainability, I am now able to do X, Y, and Z. And in this case, since it is a business German course, they are also bringing in the idea of Hofstede's cultural dimensions, which can be implied in different manners, but also goes back into our idea of global competency as well. But with this, as we see, they are diving into their can-do statements to really make sure that they have learned all the topics of this. They also learned the German in this particular case that they wanted to learn, but not just that, they're able to then progress further with a business German sustainable topic later in life. So the last topic to go into today, and I will hopefully go through this a little quicker since I know we've lost about 10 minutes now, but is sustainability with technology and world languages and what the role of technology does for global perspectives in language learning. Of course, we have to think about sustainable practices. So what does this mean, especially when we start thinking about language and dialect preservation? Again, going into the idea of accessibility for all so that all students are able to learn languages no matter where they are, what background they come from, that language learning is a communal item. How online items potentially can be more sustainable options, but also making sure that we are trying our best to select sustainable modes of material use. I know that CLET and the CLET Gruppe has a really big commitment in sustainable modes of material use, and we're really working hard to make sure that our books are produced as sustainable as possible, as well as our technology in the same way. You also want to make sure that you talk about how different languages and cultures are solving their own climate issues and how those can compare to ours. One thing that was always a great bridge connection with my students was going to that target language country or countries and finding the different news articles of potential events that happened in our own country. So showing the students, when I still worked and lived in Tennessee, showing my students how the Germans were reporting over some of the tornadoes that happened there back in 2019, 2020, and showing my students how maybe the COVID pandemic was being perceived in the German lens, but in America. So it's really great to show how we are really in this together, but also showing sustainability practice while we're learning languages. And of course, we want to compare and contrast different languages within the setting of language learning classrooms. So making sure that all of your students are getting these comparisons so that they're free of stereotypes, but they're also understanding what is being done within these sustainable practices to correlate them to their own. A few other things that we can think about when it goes into language and dialect preservation services is that there's lots of great services out there. These are just a few that I found and that I really did enjoy looking at while I was researching this. One of my favorite, and I'm really hopeful I can play the video from it, is from WikiTongues. And if you've never heard of WikiTongues, it's really interesting because they are safeguarding every language in the world. So they're finding examples of every dialect of every language that could possibly be out there. So that then it goes into the language archive. You yourself can submit videos if you're selected. You can find resources, and it's a great way to find different languages. And like I said, I'm really hopeful to show one in just a minute, as I did promise it at the beginning of our webinar. We also have other items such as the Endangered Languages Project, which is a great organization which is trying to make sure that endangered languages are staying alive in some form. And as we see just by reading here briefly, over 40% of the world's approximate 7,000 languages are at risk of disappearing. So what can we do while learning the languages that we have in our own courses to make sure that these native languages are also being preserved at the same time? We have a research guide such as keeping in indigenous languages within your language acquisition and making sure that you know and your students know that there are guides in order to see how indigenous languages, and of course in these examples we have more from the American perspective of indigenous languages for now. And then the last one is the Language Conservatory that I saw hosted by, I believe this one, oh, sorry, the other one was, but this is another great website where you can then see how other languages are being preserved, but not just that, making sure that we are keeping indigenous voices at the forefront as well. So like I said, I'm really hopeful this video will load for just a minute. I'm sure some of my German teachers already know this video quite well, or have seen it go through the different social media trends. But when talking about WikiTongues, we have to talk about all dialects of German. And since I'm a non-native German speaker myself, I learned German as a second language. I didn't start till college. I, of course, never really got rid of the dialect, but it's still interesting to keep the dialect that we always have. And this lady, her name is Vernell, she lives in Texas, and she speaks what is called Texas German. And a researcher at the University of Texas, Arlington, I believe, is trying to keep the Texas German alive in some capacities. So let's watch just a brief snip of this video.
Ich heiße Vernell Ehler. Ich bin 6-mal nördlich von Friedrichsburg geboren. Zu der Zeit waren die meisten Kinder noch zu Hause geboren. Und ich kann mich nicht erinnern, wo ich nicht beide Sprachen konnte, Deutsch und Englisch. Ich habe es zur selben Zeit gelernt. Und dann bin ich 3 Jahre nach einer Country-Schule gegangen. Und dann haben sie uns nach die Stadt geschickt. Und so habe ich dann fertig gemacht bei Friedrichsburg. Und ich bin hier in die Schule fertig gemacht und in die Hochschule.
So of course you can go back and finish this video along with other WikiTongue videos that we have here, but great examples of how language has made itself available in more contexts than just in, as we see here, the German context as in German Germany, but then also the German context as we know of the Texas German dialect that was here and is still in America today. And of course, there's lots of other dialectual groups that we still see in America today, as well as in other countries, that are really interesting to make sure that we do preserve within our sustainability practices. We also want to recognize what culture or what cultures that you're presenting from or where you are presenting from. So I am located in Chicago, Illinois. So I did look this up just a minute ago, and I do find this tool really interesting. I learned about it at a technology conference a couple of years ago. And what's really neat about with this tool is you can put your address in, you can put your city in, what have you, and it will let you know all of the local names of indigenous groups that could have been in that region and more history about it. I really wanted to go, I almost went to a small rabbit hole about this earlier, but I really thought that this was a great way for you to be able to bring in indigenous voices into your classroom, be it that you're studying a different country within the L2, or even if you wanted to look within your own area of what indigenous languages could have been spoken at some point in time within the region that you are. As last, we do want to start looking at efforts that are outside of the USA, of course, or outside of the North America, as we should say. So what lessons have we learned from different Dachländer, that I like to say, or German-speaking countries from Europe, as well as the Americas? What green policies are being introduced, possibly? What green practices, or what green energy and what green practices are they currently working on? What are some type of these indigenous ecological knowledges that are being brought more into modern society? And how are we really looking into perspectives such as sustainable agriculture? Because your student who's learning Spanish, he may think, why do I need to learn Spanish? Why do I need to learn French? I'm going to go be a farmer. It's because maybe you need to learn news articles. You need to read more of the research later to learn how these sustainability practices are affecting farms, not just here in your area, but of course around the entire world. But of course, we do have to be reminded of unsustainable practices as well. As much as we all love Google, as much as we all love our devices and everything, right now we really don't have great ways of recycling our different devices that we use every day. Our phones are not really that recyclable. The iDevices, the computers that we're all on, they are great tools for us to be more sustainable, but also there's lots of items within these that are not as sustainable practices as well. So what are some ways that we can use these items while at the same time being as sustainable within world language acquisition at the same time? So a few more examples of how these can be used in language learning and what are a few things that we could be doing within language learning with this is, how do we see our world in the future? I thought this was a really great example from our Gropoteros Cuatro book, or excuse me, Gropoteros Tres book, I believe. And within this, we're seeing our students are thinking about, what do we think in the next 50 years? What are some things that we are really looking at? Some of my favorite videos I've ever watched were those videos from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, where they're thinking, what will we look like in 50 years? Or what will technology be like? And we're at that stage again that we're really starting to think, wow, if we're so advanced now, what will 50 years be like? And students can really start being creative. They can use critical thinking skills again in order to think about the future, what we have going on, but then not just that. In this example, we again are going through the interpretive mode in order to make sure that students are getting vocabulary, grammar, as well as listening and reading examples. Some other items are ways that we can change our cities a little bit. So maybe making cities less car forward and a little more transit or pedestrian forward as well. What are some uses of this? Looking at parks and how parks really help with people as well, but maybe what are some negativities with parks? And this is again from Gropoteros. And then an example here that I have from Classe is, what are some of the ways that we are now looking into electricity and other type of e-ways to get around? So really talking about, the e-scooters, your electric cars, looking at maybe windmills and solar panels. How are we really progressing with that, both in our world language classroom, but then also within our own cross-curricular disciplines as well. And of course, as I did allude to a minute ago, technology is sustainable, but it may not always be as sustainable across every culture. We do have to keep in mind that every culture will have limited abilities of sustainable resources. So just because one region of the states of our country might be very sustainable forward doesn't mean that the other side of the country is or has caught up yet. It also means that you can then create that discourse within class that really helps your students understand how these topics really play into everyday life. One thing, and as we all currently are, it's a lot of screen time as well. Being on your iDevice, being on your computer, it's a lot of screen time. It's a lot of extra energy being used instead of just reading a book, writing on paper. But it's also a way for us to connect together. Even though we had a little bit of internet hiccups there for a few minutes, I'm sure we have people here from across the entire country, if not even from multiple countries, which is a great way for us to be able to expand this knowledge. Of course, I was a teacher, just like many of you are. We have time constraints. I taught 2 days a week for an hour and a half. I had 4 preps. When was I supposed to also bring in sustainability? But if we're really incorporating all of these items while we're talking about the other daily perspectives that we need to go into our language classroom, then the time constraints will indeed be there, but it won't be as bad. And of course, AI, a lot of us use this. I can say I've used it a little bit today to help me with my presentation, but there's also a lot of unknowns with AI in order to know what are the energy needs out needs for AI right now? Is it using a lot? Are we being sustainable with those practices? Is it affecting countries that we might not know that are affecting? And these are great ways to really bring in this conversation to your students so that they're understanding more than, oh, I'm going to use AI in order to write my paper for me, but rather let's use AI as this tool that can help us with language acquisition. So in summary, we want to bring sustainability in classrooms as much as possible. This is a great topic. Again, this has been a topic that's been in my life, my entire educational journey since I was starting school way back when in the 90s, till I graduated in the 2000s with my graduate degree. Sustainability has always been the forefront of my language acquisition. It was a little odd to me that my home city didn't have a bus system or a train that went through it, especially after I'd studied German and I'd been to Germany, I'd been to Europe. I'm like, but why don't we have these sustainable practices here? So then it really helps create that global voice so that students can then progress further with their own knowledge, but then maybe even bring in that own discourse into their own area from what they've learned from a different culture as well. We also can bring into these AP themes a lot of items such as transitioning into comparing how cultural practices may help with sustainable practices as well. But we need to be mindful about how sustainable are these practices, especially with technology. And my last point for this will be finding practice classroom and cross-curricular uses of language, because at the end of the day, we really want to make sure that students are being as engaged in the language as possible, but not just engaged in the language, but being engaged as being 21st century world-ready students that are getting ready to go into the world, either having graduated grad school, undergrad, or even high school. So a couple things just to remind you about as we will be underway and as we do have more Central States webinars coming up. But again, this was in collaboration with Central States, so Global Goals, Global Languages. I'm really excited to have been invited to this. Both my colleagues Katrin Franzo-Luc and Juanita Calvo have done presentations, and this is a great way for you to learn more, get this professional development that you may need. And we do have one more presentation coming up. I believe, my colleague has this with her, but it is going to be with Diego Ojeda, and it's about bringing global issues into language learning, how we can connect with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So going into those goals a bit more further that I showed you earlier from our Devero, our Impulse Deutsch, as well as those goals in particular. And don't forget, we are more than a world language company. We're here to help you in so many more ways. We have a KWL learning community. I'm so thankful that you have all been here tonight, part of our KWL learning community, but we are also here to help with professional development and other items. I'm sure I'll talk to many of you soon as your Midwestern sales consultant, but know that we're here not just to sell textbooks, but to make sure that you have the best time in your classroom so that your students are having a great time.
And we actually do have a couple questions that we can go for. Just before that, so everyone knows, I'm going to put the feedback form link in here so everyone can check it out. We will really appreciate it. And as for the questions, the first one we have is, how can we introduce sustainability topics to students who have little prior exposure to global environmental issues?
Yes, that is a good question. And something I did struggle with myself. I definitely would recommend bringing it in small chunks. So some ways that I definitely saw doing this is first maybe introduce, hey, let's talk about transportation in the world language classrooms. Let's bring in small little transportation. And how do you get around to school? Oh, you drive your car every day? Well, did you know some people take the bus or some people take a train? And then it really brings them into this idea so that then later you can start going more into, okay, well, now let's talk about the political implications of how bringing in this public transportation can affect different communities, or how even our own interstate system did displace communities as well.
Okay, now, yeah, it's good.
Displace communities as well. So then you can really bridge that connection, starting out small with something as basic as, hey, here's just some transportation. Here, we're going to talk about food. Hey, let's talk about how cows affect the CO emissions a little bit, right? And then you can keep going from there, as I find.
Perfect. Thank you so much. The next question we have is how can teachers foster meaningful discussions on sustainability while being sensitive to different cultural perspectives?
Yes. And this is also something that at the beginning I did struggle with as well, and I still do struggle because you want to be as free from stereotypes, as free as you can be from making sure that you're not being offensive towards a group. So I always recommend at first do as much research as you know that you can do so that you are able to deter any of the potential conversations that could happen in your class. But not just that, make sure that, again, if you find that your students could be a little immature, might not perceive the topic as well, maybe introduce it into small chunks over the first couple of weeks so that then that doesn't become a discourse, but rather that students are seeing it as a perspective of language learning and not something that's fostering an idea that they may not themselves agree with, or even that could lead to them perceiving a culture not as well. And then also with this, we want to remember to bring in all native voices if possible. So just because we are talking about our potential, the L2, L3, we want to also remember that other languages could be implied within this. So to show examples of where this language is used, how it's used, and if at all possible, free from these stereotypes and other forms of cultural misuse.
Great, thank you. Another question that we have is regarding the video of the women in Germany, which was very interesting. But it is in case you could please remind us how you make this part of your sustainability approach.
Yes, so with this one, I want to remind students that there are more voices in Germany that may not always, or in whichever culture you may be delving into, that might not speak the language there or might not be allowed to speak the language. As if we could have watched more of that video, we would have seen there that some of these women are unable to learn German because their families may not allow them to, or they may not allow them to leave the house outside of special visits to the scenarios that we heard in the example from the women in the video. So I find that using this as sustainability is that you're sustaining that there's more than one cultural voice within the language, but then there's other cultural perspectives, and that these other cultural perspectives do need to be brought into the discourse of language acquisition, and how hopefully we can then maybe help these women learn the language there, or even help progress the language learning through other means.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Then another question we have that pop up on the chat is how can we avoid political points of view in the different sustainability topics?
Oh man.
Yep.
I knew this was probably going to be a question. That is hard, especially in the K-12 environment. I didn't try within preparing for this presentation. I wanted to try my best to be as apolitical as possible as well, because there is the idea that sustainability is political and is politically driven. Even if we do look at the UN's version of their sustainability goals, there are some goals that we may not even align in our own country currently. So I could see that being a point of contention. But at the same time, these are goals that are being set forth by multiple countries, by multiple nations, that can be addressed and should be addressed as well. And as I try to do in this presentation, and I know that some of our other colleagues may try to do, is sometimes a political discourse is going to happen, and it's where your comfort level lies of letting it either continue on or not continue it at all. One of my favorite projects I did while teaching was I wanted my students to discover more about the Afro-Deutsche, so the Afro-German in the German culture. But instead of requiring it as a project they had to do, it was always an extracurricular project that they could do that would go towards another item grade or another perspective. So I didn't want to bring it as a political topic in class, but I wanted my students still to see that, hey, this is a great topic that you can research, but you don't have to do it either. And that's one great thing that we also have in a few of our textbooks. Again, working for CLET, is that some of these items that are in the book are what we call deepening hours, if you will. So really making sure that the students are furthering in their knowledge of the language or the culture. And some of these items, if you find in your course, may be politically taboo, or you may have parents that could complain. That's why they're called deepening hours, or that's why within that curriculum, you can really try to limit what you want to be said in class. But no, it is hard. I mean, it was one of those, I taught in East Tennessee for 8 years, and sometimes you would just breathe the wrong way and people would think that you were starting a political conversation. So, you do have to sometimes walk on eggshells while still making sure that you're staying true to your values. And that's one thing that I think is important, is staying true to your pedagogical values so that you're pushing your mission as a world language teacher.
Great, thank you. And let's see. So far, this is the last question, unless someone else has another one. We still have like 10 more minutes. But the question is, what are some small manageable steps for teachers who wants to start incorporating sustainability but feel overwhelmed?
Yeah. So I would go back to the topic of, scaffolding and the chunked approach. So start out with what, maybe like I did at the very beginning, give your students a poll, even if it's in English, if it's an upper level language class, and of course you could do it in the target language, and just ask them, hey, do you think about sustainability? Is this something that you do in your daily life? Do you recycle? I mean, that's a question I would ask my students every semester. Recycle, Stu? And a lot of them would say, no, I don't. And that's okay, right? And it's okay if your students say, no, I drive every day. No, I take the bus. No, we use this type of energy. And it's just a way for students to really use that language, even though it may be items that you're not wanting the answer to, but it's also how they progress with their daily life as well. And I also find that with bringing in the other topics, so if you're talking about travel, it's easy to kind of interlude one of these topics. So, hey, we're going to talk about travel. Let's look at this article about ecotourism and how, I don't know, Switzerland is looking into doing more eco-touristic practices when people come to go hiking in the mountains. So then you're talking about hiking, then you're talking about weather, then you're talking about maybe snowboarding, and then you're talking about all other topics, but then implicitly, you're also talking about ecotourism at the same time. So then you're really bringing in a true, fully faceted approach. But then again, I would start with the basics that you're going to be going into. So making sure the students do have that vocabulary. So if you're talking about travel, make sure they know the vocabulary of different modes of transportation. Maybe when you look into travel, tell them, hey, let's plan a trip to Germany. How are you going to get there? Can you look at the emissions that you're going to be using by flying over there versus by taking a boat over there? Okay, well, now maybe you want to fly into France because the emissions are lower. What will it cost you now to take a train from France to the place in Germany? And what would the emissions cost be for that? So then you could really move into different perspectives of, hey, we're traveling, but let's think about travel in a world perspective, such as carbon emissions. But then with that, you're even going into a bit of science and math because they have to do some calculations. So if I spend 3,000 carbon emissions flying, but 2,500 taking a train, but then I have this much time, they're having to do a little bit of calculations too, which will then really bring in this gap of cross-curricular perspectives too. And then some other examples, I would definitely say, again, bringing in these other native voices and make sure that these voices are being kept into in dialects as well. I loved bringing in every single dialectual group I could find from the German-speaking world, even my Texas German I showed you all. And then also making sure that you see how your students are reacting. If they feel overwhelmed, then maybe slow down a little bit or move on to another topic within. Or if you see that they're feeling a little politically discouraged, we'll say, then I would recommend maybe finding a topic that will help them feel more comfortable again, and then go back into that topic because maybe they don't have all that knowledge they need yet so that they do feel uncomfortable. Whereas 2 chapters later, it could be a topic that they're very interested in. Yeah.
Perfect, Tyler. Thank you so much. So, again, thank you for the presentation, for all the knowledge and all the insight. With this, we conclude today's session. We also want to thank again Daryl for being with us, for this collaboration with Central States. Remember, we will have further ones. And I also want to place the link for the Central States Conference in case you want to take a look at it. Also, as we mentioned before, Tyler did mention we have the webinar on April with Diego Ojeda. So please sign up for that. We put the link before in the chat. And also, in case you want a previous webinar, we have one on the 27th of March, which is Grammar Alive, Enhancing Language Learning Through a Cultural Context. That's from another series we've been doing. And as I mentioned before, please give us your feedback. We would really appreciate to know how we can improve, what you liked. And if you have any questions, please remember to send us an email at marketing@cletwl.com. We will try to answer it. If you have any questions, here we are. So, yes, thank you so much for everything. And I hope you have a great rest of the afternoon, evening.